At 0300 hours on a moonless night in September 1944, a young driver named James Rookard gripped the wheel of his GMC truck and stared into absolute darkness. Somewhere ahead, barely visible, 4 tiny slits of red light floated in the void. Those lights were his only guide. They belonged to the truck in front of him, 50 feet away, invisible except for those pinpricks of crimson. Behind him, another truck followed his own rear markers, and behind that truck, another. And another. A convoy of ghosts hauling 5 tons of ammunition through the French countryside at 40 miles per hour, with no headlights, no moon, and no margin for error. The road beneath his tires had been cratered by Allied bombs just weeks earlier. German landmines still lurked in the shoulders. Piano wire strung by retreating enemy soldiers could decapitate a man at this speed. And Rookard had been driving for over 20 hours straight. His eyes burned. His hands ached. Every few minutes, his head would drop toward his chest, and he would jerk awake to find the truck drifting toward a ditch or a stone wall. He was 19 years old. He had never driven a truck before the army put him behind this wheel, and the fate of the Allied advance across Europe depended on him reaching Chartres before dawn. This was not a single heroic journey. This was the daily reality for 23,000 drivers who ran the Red Ball Express, the most desperate and dangerous supply operation in military history. For 82 consecutive days in the autumn of 1944, these men drove 2.5-ton GMC trucks across France in a non-stop relay that kept the liberation of Europe alive. The standard round trip from the Normandy beaches to the front lines took 54 hours. Most of it was driven in total blackout conditions, and roughly 3/4 of these drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in a segregated army that considered them unfit for combat, yet trusted them with the mission that would determine whether the war could be won. The truck that made this possible was the GMC CCKW, known to every soldier who ever rode in one as the Jimmy. It was not glamorous. It was not fast. It would never appear on a recruiting poster or inspire a Hollywood epic. But without it, the tanks would have stopped rolling, the artillery would have fallen silent, and the liberation of Paris would have been the high watermark of the Allied advance instead of its beginning. The Jimmy was a 2.5-ton 6x6 cargo truck, meaning it had 6 wheels with power to all 6. The designation CCKW was Army code. C meant it was designed in 1941. The second C meant conventional cab with the engine in front. K meant all-wheel drive. W meant dual rear axles. Soldiers ignored all that and just called it the Jimmy, or the deuce and a half. General George Patton himself declared that the 2.5-ton truck was the most valuable weapon in the American arsenal. Coming from a man obsessed with tanks, that was extraordinary praise. But Patton understood what many armchair strategists did not. Tanks without fuel are just expensive pillboxes. Artillery without shells is just scrap metal. An army runs on its stomach, and in 1944, its stomach was fed entirely by truck. The Jimmy was powered by a GMC 270 engine, an overhead valve inline 6-cylinder that produced 91.5 horsepower from 269 cubic inches. That does not sound impressive by modern standards, but the engine was designed for reliability, not speed. It could run for thousands of miles on bad fuel, in extreme temperatures, with minimal maintenance. The truck had a 5-speed manual transmission with a 2-speed transfer case, giving drivers 10 forward gears to work with. The official top speed was 45 miles per hour. The official payload capacity was 5,000 pounds or 2.5 tons. The official fuel consumption was around 6 miles per gallon. In practice, Red Ball drivers ignored all 3 numbers. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 518,000 of these trucks. That made it the second most produced American military vehicle of the entire war, behind only the Jeep. The yellow truck and coach division of General Motors in Pontiac, Michigan built most of them, with additional production at Chevrolet plants in St. Louis. They rolled off assembly lines at a rate that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, and they rolled straight onto cargo ships bound for England, then France, then the roads of the Red Ball Express. The truck could be configured in more than 50 different variants: cargo haulers, fuel tankers carrying 750 gallons, water tankers, dump trucks, surgical vans, communications vehicles, wreckers for towing disabled equipment, The Red Ball Express used them all, but the standard cargo configuration was the most common. A canvas-covered bed that could hold ammunition, rations, medical supplies, spare parts, or whatever else the front lines needed to keep fighting. But the Jimmy had one critical limitation that would define the Red Ball experience. Every truck came from the factory with a governor installed on the engine, limiting top speed to around 45 miles per hour. This was a safety feature, designed to prevent inexperienced drivers from pushing the truck beyond its mechanical tolerances. Red Ball Express drivers and mechanics removed these governors almost immediately. They had schedules to keep, they had quotas to meet, and they had generals screaming for supplies that should have arrived yesterday. With the governors gone, the trucks could reach 60 or even 70 miles per hour on good roads. The problem was that the roads were not good, and the drivers were exhausted, and they were driving in the dark. The Red Ball Express was born from the greatest logistical crisis of World War II. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The plan called for a slow, methodical advance through France, with supply lines extending gradually as territory was secured. Planners expected to reach the Seine River by September. They expected to reach the German border sometime in 1945. The front lines were supposed to advance at roughly one phase line per day, giving logistics units time to establish depots, repair roads, and build up stockpiles for the next push. The plan did not survive contact with the enemy. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout from the Normandy hedgerow country near the town of St. Lo. The German defences, weakened by weeks of attrition, collapsed faster than anyone had anticipated. Third Army under Patton poured through the gap and began racing across France at a pace that stunned both the enemy and Allied command. First Army under General Courtney Hodges followed close behind. By late August, American tanks had covered 300 miles in less than 3 weeks. They had liberated Paris on August 25th. They were approaching the Belgian border, and they had completely outrun their own supply lines. The problem was simple mathematics. Allied armies needed approximately 21,000 tons of supplies every day to sustain offensive operations. Fuel alone accounted for a huge portion of that. Third Army and First Army combined were burning 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day. But 90 to 95% of all Allied supplies were still sitting in Normandy, 300 to 400 miles behind the front lines. The stockpiles were enormous. 600,000 tons of materiel had been unloaded on the beaches and at the port of Cherbourg. The supplies existed. They just could not get to the troops who needed them. The obvious solution was railroads. France had one of the finest rail networks in Europe, but that network had been deliberately destroyed by Allied strategic bombing in the months before D-Day. The transportation plan, as it was called, targeted bridges, marshalling yards, and rail lines across northern France to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. The plan worked brilliantly for its intended purpose. 18 of the 24 bridges between Rouen and Paris were completely destroyed. But now, the Allies needed those railroads, and they no longer existed. Retreating German forces demolished whatever the bombers had missed. Engineers worked frantically to repair the damage, but rebuilding a rail network takes months. The major Channel ports were no help either. Le Havre was still in German hands. Antwerp would not be captured until September, and its port would not become operational until late November. Cherbourg was available but badly damaged. The Mulberry artificial harbours at the invasion beaches were useful but limited in capacity. Pipelines were under construction to bring fuel directly from England, but they were months from completion. The only way to move supplies from Normandy to the front was by truck. In late August, logistics officers gathered for an emergency planning session that lasted 36 hours. The situation was desperate. Frontline units were running out of ammunition. Tank crews were abandoning vehicles for lack of fuel. Patton was apoplectic. At one point, a convoy of rations arrived at his headquarters instead of the gasoline he had demanded. Patton reportedly threatened to shoot the next man who brought him food instead of fuel. Something had to be done immediately, or the Allied advance would grind to a halt and give the Germans time to regroup behind their fortified Siegfried Line. The solution came from Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Albert Ayers, a logistics officer who proposed something that had never been attempted on this scale. A dedicated truck route, closed to all other traffic, running around the clock in a continuous loop. The concept was inspired by one-way streets in American cities. Loaded trucks would travel east from Normandy toward the front on a northern route. Empty trucks would return west on a parallel southern route. Both routes would be reserved exclusively for supply convoys, enforced by military police, who would turn away any civilian or unauthorized military vehicle. The loop would run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with trucks leaving as soon as they were loaded, no waiting for scheduled convoys. The name came from railroad terminology. In American freight yards, a red ball was the symbol painted on the most urgent priority shipments, the ones that received right-of-way over all other traffic. This supply operation would have absolute priority over everything else on the roads of France. It would be the Red Ball Express. The operation launched on August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated. Within 4 days, it had scaled from 67 truck companies to 132 companies, operating nearly 6,000 vehicles. On August 29th, the 4th day of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day. That was more than half of the entire daily requirement for all Allied forces in France, moved entirely by truck over roads that barely deserved the name. The route initially ran from Saint-Lô near the invasion beaches to Chartres, a distance of about 125 miles each way. As the front advanced, the route extended to Soissons, Sommessus, and eventually beyond, with the round-trip distance growing to over 400 miles. The standard round trip took approximately 54 hours, with drivers expected to average 10 hours of driving per day in 2 5-hour shifts. 2-man crews were assigned to each truck so one could sleep while the other drove, in theory. In practice, the arrangement was wholly inadequate. Both men were usually awake, fighting exhaustion together, because sleeping in a bouncing truck cab on a cratered road was nearly impossible. James Rookard was 19 years old when he joined the Red Ball Express. He came from Maple Heights, Ohio, and like most of his fellow drivers, he had no civilian trucking experience. The Army had given him a few weeks of basic training on vehicle operation before shipping him to France. Now he was piloting an overloaded deuce and a half through the darkness at speeds that would have terrified a professional driver in daylight conditions. Years later, he would recall what those nights were like. He said he had driven when he could hardly see, just by instinct. "You sort of feel the road," he explained. "You listen for the engine note changing when the grade shifts. You watch those little lights ahead and pray the driver in front of you does not make any sudden moves." Rookard said his worst memories were not of the exhaustion or the danger. They were of seeing other trucks get blown up by mines or bombs and wondering if he would be next. Dead bodies and dead horses lay on the highways after air attacks. Sometimes the convoy would have to drive around them, sometimes over them. There was no time to stop. The supplies had to get through. John Houston drove for C Company, 514th Truck Regiment. He would later become known as the father of the singer, Whitney Houston. In interviews after the war, Houston was blunt about the lack of recognition. He said the Army would never have won without them, without the Red Ball Express drivers, but they never got enough credit for what they did. Robert Emerick, of the 3,580th Quartermaster Truck Company, once fell asleep at the wheel despite his best efforts to stay awake. His truck careened off the road and nearly killed him. He survived by luck. Many others did not. Emerick also remembered the hypnotic effect of blackout driving. "You would be watching those little blackout lights," he said, "and it drove you blind. It was like hypnosis. Your eyes would fixate on those tiny red slits until your brain stopped processing anything else." Washington Rector, of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company, remembered something else entirely: the racism. He said, "You accepted discrimination because you had no choice." Black soldiers were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise. They slept in segregated bivouac areas. They ate in segregated mess facilities. White officers commanded black enlisted men and made sure everyone knew the hierarchy. And yet these same men who were considered unfit to fight alongside white soldiers were trusted with the most critical supply mission of the war. Approximately 73 to 75% of the truck companies assigned to the Red Ball Express were African American. This was not because black soldiers were considered especially suited for driving. It was because the strict racial segregation policies of the army relegated black soldiers almost exclusively to service and support roles, quartermaster truck companies, port battalions, loading details. The official reasoning, never stated explicitly but understood by everyone, was that black soldiers supposedly lacked the intelligence, courage, and skill needed for combat. Over 1 million African Americans served in uniform during World War II. The vast majority were assigned to duties that kept them far from glory, but essential to victory. The irony was bitter and obvious to everyone except apparently the generals who maintained the policies. White soldiers were sometimes shocked to encounter white Red Bull drivers. One white soldier asked Robert Emerick why he was not black, assuming that all truck drivers must be. Some white troops told French civilians that black soldiers had tails. The racism was casual, constant, and crushing. And yet on the road, in the dark, with shells falling and mines exploding and exhaustion clawing at their minds, the Red Bull drivers earned grudging respect that official policy could never grant. A tank driver from the 5th Armored Division later said that if it was not for the Red Bull, they could not have moved. He acknowledged that all the drivers were black and that they delivered in the heat of combat. He said the tank crews would be in their vehicles praying for the trucks to come up with fuel and ammunition. A British brigade commander observed that few who saw them would ever forget the enthusiasm of the black drivers, hell-bent, whatever the risk, to get Patton his supplies. The blackout driving conditions were the defining terror of the Red Bull Express. In the first phase of the operation, west of the Seine River, trucks could use their headlights because the area was secure from German air attack. But as the route extended eastward toward enemy positions in September, mandatory blackout conditions took effect. The Luftwaffe was weakened but not destroyed. German aircraft still prowled the night skies, looking for convoys to strafe. A column of trucks with headlights blazing would be visible for miles, an irresistible target. Every military vehicle in the American infantry was equipped with blackout lighting, a system designed for exactly these conditions. The blackout headlights were hooded fixtures that cast a thin slit of dim white light about 10 feet in front of the vehicle. This was enough to see the road surface directly ahead, but not enough to navigate at speed or spot obstacles until they were right in front of you. Only the lead vehicle in a convoy used even this much light. Every truck behind followed by watching the rear blackout markers of the vehicle ahead. These rear markers were ingeniously designed to help drivers maintain proper following distance. Each marker had 4 small slits arranged in a pattern. At the correct following distance of 60 to 180 feet, the human eye would merge these 4 slits into what appeared to be 2 lights. If a driver could see all 4 slits separately, he was too close. If they merged into a single point, he was falling too far behind. The system worked remarkably well under ideal conditions, but conditions on the Red Bull were never ideal. Vehicle dashboards were illuminated in red to preserve night vision. A special lockout button on the light switch prevented anyone from accidentally turning on the regular headlights and giving away the convoy position. Drivers learned to navigate by sound, by feel, and by faith. They listened for changes in engine tone that signaled a hill or a curve. They felt the road surface through the steering wheel, and they trusted the driver ahead to not stop suddenly, not drive off a cliff, not hit a mine. The roads themselves were nightmares. Allied bombing before D-Day had cratered highways throughout northern France. The same transportation plan that destroyed the railroads had also targeted road junctions and bridges. Combat damage added to the destruction. In some towns, rubble from collapsed buildings rose 20 feet deep. Narrow country roads that had been adequate for French farm traffic were never designed for convoys of heavy military trucks. Many were too small for two-way traffic, which was precisely why Lieutenant Colonel Ayers designed the one-way loop system. Autumn rains turned unpaved sections into rivers of mud. Shrapnel and barbed wire littered the shoulders. Abandoned military equipment, both Allied and German, created obstacles that drivers had to navigate in near total darkness. German engineers had planted landmines along the roads before retreating. Some were marked by French civilians who had watched them being buried. Many were not. Piano wire strung across roadways at neck height could decapitate a driver standing in an open cab. Snipers occasionally took shots at convoys from the woods. The Red Bull was not a combat operation, but it was not safe either. Technical Sergeant Emmanuel Wilson Green of the 3989th Motor Transport Company left behind vivid memories of what awaited at the end of each run. He recalled stepping over dead enemy soldiers at drop-off points. The front lines were not distant abstractions for these drivers. They delivered their cargo directly to combat units, sometimes under fire, sometimes within earshot of artillery exchanges. Then they turned around and drove back through the same dangers to do it again. Austin Powlis, of the 3902nd Quartermaster Company, described the experience in stark terms. He said they would drive and be fired upon at the same time. The sound of it, he said, was still ringing in his ears decades later. These men were not armed. They had no training in combat. Their job was to drive, not fight. But the enemy made no distinction between supply trucks and combat vehicles. A truck full of ammunition was a legitimate target. So was a truck full of gasoline. The drivers knew this every time they climbed into the cab. The 40-gallon fuel tank of the GMC CCKW gave it a theoretical range of 240 to 300 miles under load. In practice, the range was often less because of the strain of overloading and the poor quality of French roads. Trucks frequently ran out of fuel and had to be refueled from the cargo they carried. This created an absurd situation where drivers hauling gasoline to the front would siphon fuel from their own cargo to keep moving. Every gallon they used for themselves was a gallon that would not reach the combat units, but a truck stuck on the side of the road helped no one. The maintenance situation was equally dire. The Red Ball Express wore out trucks faster than they could be replaced. Vehicles designed for a service life of years were being destroyed in weeks. Engines overheated from constant high-speed operation. Transmissions failed from the strain of overloading. Brakes wore out from the constant stop-and-go of convoy driving. Steering components failed on cratered roads. The 793rd Military Police Battalion that patrolled the routes reported constant traffic jams caused by disabled vehicles blocking the single-lane roads. Mechanics worked around the clock at repair depots along the route, but they could only do so much. Parts were in short supply. Many repairs were improvised. Vehicles that should have been taken out of service were patched together and sent back out because there were no replacements available. The pressure to keep trucks moving outweighed safety considerations. If a truck could move under its own power, it was sent back to the convoy. If it could not, it was pushed to the side of the road and stripped for parts. The human cost was impossible to calculate precisely because no one was keeping count. The Army did not compile casualty statistics for the Red Ball Express as a separate operation. Deaths and injuries were recorded by individual units, scattered across dozens of truck companies. Some records were lost. Some were never created in the first place. Researchers who have tried to reconstruct the toll have found it frustratingly incomplete. What survives are individual stories, fragments of a larger picture that will never be fully assembled. The bivouac areas where drivers were supposed to rest were inadequate by the Army own admission. Facilities were primitive. Food was often cold by the time it reached the drivers. Sleep was interrupted by the constant noise of trucks arriving and departing. Some drivers gave up on the bivouacs entirely and simply slept in their cabs when they could no longer keep their eyes open. This was dangerous, but sometimes it was the only option. The psychological toll was harder to measure than the physical toll. Men who had survived the Red Ball Express rarely talked about it in the years immediately after the war. The experience was too raw, too exhausting, too unglamorous to fit the narratives that veterans were expected to share. Combat veterans came home to parades and honors. Truck drivers came home to silence. Many felt that what they had done did not count as real service, even though they knew better. It took decades for the full story to emerge. As the veterans aged and began to pass away, some finally felt ready to share their memories. Oral history projects captured their voices before they were lost forever. Academic historians began to recognize the significance of the operation. The racial dimension of the story attracted new attention as American society grappled with its history of segregation and discrimination. The Red Ball Express became a symbol of something larger than itself. It represented the hidden contributions of Black Americans to the war effort. It represented the essential but unglamorous work of logistics that makes combat operations possible. It represented the human capacity to endure seemingly impossible conditions when the stakes are high enough. It represented all the soldiers whose service was essential but overlooked. The trucks themselves became symbols too. The GMC CCKW was not the fastest or most powerful vehicle in the American arsenal. It was not designed for glory. It was designed to carry cargo from one place to another, reliably and efficiently. It did that job better than any truck before it. More than 500,000 of them rolled off assembly lines during the war. Thousands of them are still in existence today, preserved by collectors and museums and military history enthusiasts who recognize their significance. When you stand next to a restored Jimmy at a military vehicle show or a museum exhibit, you are looking at the machine that made the liberation of Europe possible, not the tanks that broke through German lines. Not the aircraft that bombed enemy positions. A truck. An unglamorous, reliable, essential truck. The kind of vehicle that never appears on recruiting posters but without which armies cannot function. The men who drove those trucks through France in the autumn of 1944 understood this better than anyone. They knew that their cargo was more important than their comfort. They knew that the front lines depended on them. They knew that every hour of delay meant soldiers going without ammunition or fuel or food. They drove until they could not drive anymore, and then they drove some more. They did this for 82 days straight, until the emergency finally ended and other supply routes could take over. The official convoy rules were sensible and completely ignored. Regulations called for speeds of 25 miles per hour, 60-yard intervals between vehicles, 10-minute rest stops at prescribed times. Minimum 5 truck convoys escorted by jeeps. In reality, individual trucks often departed as soon as they were loaded, racing alone or in small groups to meet their quotas. Governors were stripped from engines. Speeds exceeded 60 miles per hour on any stretch of decent pavement. Rest stops were skipped. Drivers pushed themselves to the absolute limit of human endurance and beyond. The consequences were predictable and devastating. Precise casualty figures for the Red Ball Express were never compiled in aggregate. This gap in the historical record itself reflects how the operation and its predominantly black workforce were undervalued by military record keepers. Multiple official sources use careful language, stating that scores of drivers and assistant drivers were killed or injured by enemy fire, landmines, aerial attack, and accidents. What is documented is the staggering rate of vehicle destruction. Hundreds of vehicles required repair every day during the operation. The majority of these were from wrecks, overwhelmingly single-vehicle accidents caused by exhaustion, excessive speed, overloading, and blackout conditions. The operation consumed materiel at an astonishing rate. Over 40,000 truck tires wore out in the first month alone, with the total reaching nearly 50,000 by the end of the 82-day run. The Red Ball trucks burned an estimated 300,000 gallons of fuel per day, a bitter irony since the operation existed primarily to deliver fuel to the front. Roughly 1/3 of all gasoline transported by the Red Ball was consumed by the trucks doing the transporting. This circular inefficiency meant the operation was partially feeding its own supply crisis. Morale and discipline deteriorated as exhaustion accumulated over weeks. Desperate for rest, some drivers deliberately sabotaged their own vehicles, damaging fuel lines or ignition systems to get a few hours of sleep while waiting for repairs. Others got conveniently lost near French towns, where they could find a barn or basement to collapse in. A lucrative black market emerged. French civilians would pay $100 for a single 5-gallon jerrycan of gasoline. Cigarettes, rations, and sugar were traded like precious jewels. Supplies were pilfered from convoys. German prisoners of war assigned to service points were caught putting water in fuel cans. By the final weeks of the operation, the official assessment from the army acknowledged that the logistics network had come perilously close to the brink of collapse. The Red Ball Express was never designed to run for 82 days. It was conceived as a 2-week emergency measure, but the emergency never ended, and neither did the trucks. What was at stake justified every sacrifice. Third Army alone required 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day to maintain offensive operations. By late August, Patton was receiving barely 25,000 gallons daily, less than 7% of what he needed. In early September, Third Army ran completely out of fuel near the Meuse River and sat idle for 5 days, while German forces regrouped and fortified their positions. 5 days of lost momentum translated into months of additional fighting and thousands of additional casualties. The supply crisis was not about shortages at source. 600,000 long tons of supplies sat stockpiled in Normandy 2 months after D-Day. The problem was purely transportation. Between August 25th and September 12th, Allied armies advanced through 260 phase lines in just 19 days. The original Overlord plan had projected that advance taking 260 days. The supply apparatus simply could not keep pace with armies moving 10 times faster than expected. General Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. He could not supply everyone. He ultimately gave logistical priority to Field Marshal Montgomery and the 21st Army Group for Operation Market Garden. The ambitious but ultimately failed attempt to capture bridges in the Netherlands and outflank the Siegfried Line. This decision further starved the offensive in the south. The resulting pause gave Germany critical weeks to reorganize. At Metz, German forces would hold Third Army for 3 months in some of the bloodiest fighting of the Western Front. Would faster supply have changed the outcome of the war? Historians have debated this question for decades. Some argue that if Patton had received adequate fuel in early September, he could have crossed the Rhine before German defences solidified, potentially ending the war in 1944. Others contend that German resistance would have stiffened regardless, and that the Allies lacked the troop strength to exploit any breakthrough. What is beyond debate is that the Red Ball Express gave the Allies their only chance to find out. Without it, there would have been no debate at all. The advance would have stopped at the Seine. John Eisenhower, the son of the Supreme Commander, served as a liaison officer during the campaign. He later wrote that the spectacular nature of the advance was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks. Without the Red Ball Express, he concluded, the advance across France could not have been made. The Red Ball Express was not unique in military history. Logistics crises have plagued armies since warfare began, but the scale and intensity of this particular operation set it apart. In World War I, the motorized truck proved its value for the first time at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. French forces organized a continuous supply line along a single road, dubbed the Voie Sacrée, or Sacred Way. Thousands of trucks made the round trip every day for months, supplying a desperate defense. The Red Ball Express operated on a vastly larger scale, over vastly greater distances, but the principle was the same. When other transportation fails, trucks can keep an army alive. The German army that the Red Ball supported the fight against had its own logistics crisis in reverse. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on horses for supply transport, over 2 million of them during the war. Germany never achieved the industrial capacity to fully motorize its forces. When German logistics collapsed during the retreat from France, there were no truck convoys to fill the gap. Armies that cannot be supplied cannot fight. After the Red Ball Express ended on November 16, 1944, other express routes continued its legacy. The White Ball Express ran from Le Havre to Paris after that port was finally cleared. The Green Diamond route supplied forces in Brittany. The Red Lion route supported the liberation of Belgium. None achieved the scale or urgency of the original Red Ball, but all followed the template it established. The lessons of the Red Ball Express shaped military logistics for generations. The United States Army rebuilt its doctrine around the principle that supply lines must be as mobile and responsive as combat forces. The interstate highway system that President Eisenhower championed in the 1950s was influenced by his first-hand experience of the French road network inadequacy. He had seen a war nearly stall for lack of decent highways. He made sure his country would never face that problem at home. The Red Ball Express was largely invisible to mainstream history for decades. Part of this was the nature of logistics work, which rarely receives the attention given to combat operations. Part of it was racial. The story of black soldiers in service roles did not fit the narrative that white America wanted to tell about the war. Some white veterans did not even know that most Red Ball drivers were African American. The story was there in the records for anyone who cared to look. Few looked. The recovery began slowly. The 1952 film Red Ball Express, starring Jeff Chandler and a young Sidney Poitier, brought the operation to popular attention for the first time. But the film controversially minimized black participation. Director Bud Bowtisher later claimed the army would not let them tell the truth about the black troops because the government figured they were expendable. Whether this was accurate or an excuse, the result was the same. The real story remained largely untold. In 2000, historian David Colley published The Road to Victory, the untold story of World War II Red Ball Express. This was the first comprehensive book-length account, built extensively on interviews with surviving veterans. Colley tracked down men like James Rookard and Washington Rector and recorded their memories before they were lost forever. The book became the foundation for all subsequent scholarship on the subject. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans features the Red Ball Express in its permanent exhibits. Photographs of the drivers and their trucks are displayed alongside tanks and aircraft. The truck that John Huston drove is not there, but his photograph is. The United States Army Transportation Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia, maintains an archive of Red Ball documents and photographs. The museum tells the story as part of the larger history of Army logistics, placing it alongside other supply operations from the American Revolution to the present day. In France, physical memorials mark the routes the trucks followed. At La Queue-les-Yvelines, original red and white milestone markers from 1944 survive at village entrances. These markers guided convoys through the French countryside in daylight hours. They were renovated for the 80th anniversary commemoration on September 28, 2024, which included a ceremony with the United States Embassy Cultural Counselor. A new commemorative plaque was unveiled, recognizing the drivers who passed through the village 8 decades earlier. The Liberation route across France is now marked as a tourist trail. Visitors can follow the roads the Red Ball trucks traveled, though those roads have been widened and paved in the years since. The crater holes are filled, the rubble is cleared, the landmines are gone. It takes imagination to picture what those roads looked like in the autumn of 1944, but the geography remains the same. The demonstrated competence and courage of black soldiers on the Red Ball Express contributed to the momentum for change in military policy. On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The process took years to implement fully, but the principle was established. Black soldiers had proven themselves in every role the Army gave them. The argument for segregation had always been a lie. The Red Ball Express was one more piece of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Today, almost no one who drove on the Red Ball Express remains alive. The youngest drivers in 1944 would be nearly 100 years old. Their stories survive in oral history archives, in books, and in documentaries that interviewed them while they could still remember. The 2001 documentary The Red Ball Express, running 19 minutes, finally centered the African-American experience with veteran interviews and archival footage. It was too little and too late for most of the men it honored, but it exists for their descendants and for history. The Red Ball Express did not end in a heroic battle. It did not face a climactic confrontation with the enemy. It simply ran until it was no longer needed, then stopped. On November 16, 1944, the operation officially concluded. The port of Antwerp was finally operational, providing a supply route that did not depend on trucks crossing hundreds of miles of French countryside. Railroads had been partially rebuilt, pipelines were beginning to flow, the emergency was over. But the men who drove those trucks had been changed forever. They had spent 82 days in a waking nightmare of exhaustion, danger, and relentless pressure. They had watched friends die in accidents and attacks. They had pushed their bodies and minds beyond what they thought possible. They had served a country that did not treat them as equals, defending a freedom they did not fully share. And they had done it anyway, because the job needed to be done, and they were the ones who could do it. 23,000 drivers made the approximately 54-hour round trip over and over, delivering more than 412,000 tons of supplies in less than 3 months. They wore out nearly 50,000 tires and burned 300,000 gallons of fuel per day. They drove in blackout conditions on cratered roads through hostile territory. They did not ask for glory. They did not receive much of it. They simply kept the trucks moving. James Rookard survived the war and returned to Ohio. John Huston came home and started a family. His daughter Whitney would become one of the most celebrated singers of her generation. Washington Rector lived to tell his story to historians who finally cared to ask. Robert Emerick recovered from his accident and drove until the operation ended. Thousands of others whose names were never recorded served just as faithfully and disappeared into history. The Jimmy trucks served on long after the war. Many were sold as surplus and became the workhorses of civilian construction and logging operations. Others were shipped to Allied nations and served in their armies for decades. The design influenced generations of military trucks that followed. When you see a modern Army cargo vehicle, You are looking at a descendant of the GMC CCKW that crossed France in the dark. The story of the Red Ball Express is not about a single truck or a single driver or a single journey. It is about what ordinary people can accomplish under extraordinary pressure when failure is not an option. It is about the hidden labor that makes victory possible, the unglamorous work that historians too often overlook. It is about black soldiers who served a segregated nation with distinction and received too little recognition in return. And it is about the simple, stubborn fact that armies cannot fight without supplies. Patton could not have raced across France without gasoline. The artillery could not have fired without shells. The infantry could not have eaten without rations. Every bullet, every bandage, every can of fuel that reached the front lines in the autumn of 1944 arrived there because a driver stayed awake for one more hour, drove one more mile, and refused to let the convoy stop. At 4 in the morning on a country road in France, in the autumn of 1944, a 19-year-old soldier from Ohio gripped his steering wheel and watched 4 tiny red lights floating in the darkness ahead. He could not see the road. He could barely see his own hands. But he kept driving, because the men at the front needed what he was carrying, and he was the only one who could bring it to them. That is the story of the Red Ball Express. That is the story of the GMC truck that crossed France in 54 hours with no headlights. Not one truck, thousands. Not one hero, 23,000 of them. All driving through the night, into history, and too often into obscurity. Their story deserves to be remembered, not because they sought glory, but because they earned it. Not because they asked for recognition, but because they deserved it. The liberation of Europe was won by soldiers who fired rifles and drove tanks and flew bombers. It was also won by soldiers who drove trucks through the darkness, hour after exhausting hour, delivering the fuel and ammunition that kept the war machine running. Without the Red Ball Express, there is no liberation of Paris. Without the Red Ball Express, there is no race across France. Without the Red Ball Express, the war drags on for months or years longer, and thousands more people die. That is the weight those drivers carried, along with their cargo in the bed behind them. That is the legacy they left, written in tire tracks across the French countryside. That is why their story matters, 8 decades later, and why it will still matter 8 decades from now. The men who drove the Red Ball Express did not save the world alone, but they made it possible for others to do so, and that is more than enough.